Hi there, folks. My name is Sam Kuznets. I work with Figure 53 doing support and doing product management for QLab. I write the manual for QLab. I do all kinds of things. When USITT got canceled this year, I thought the thing I get to do every year that I like so much is going to USITT, meeting people face to face, talking to them, answering whatever questions they have. And so doing something different, trying it via YouTube today. So this is an experiment. I hope it works well. If there are glitches, that's how it goes. There's no rehearsal for this. For right now, if you can let me know in the chat if you are hearing me clearly, that is the most important bit of feedback for me right now. And also, obviously, if the stream gets weird and I don't seem to notice, please say something in the chat so that I can endeavor to fix it. Alrighty. So without much further ado, oh, I see now people are saying it works. There's a lot of lag, also very peculiar, hard to get used to. All right, so let's get started before I devolve into just total sputtering. All right, so let me explain what we've got going on here. You're looking at my desktop. I've got QLab on the desktop, and I've got your chat window in a monitor to my left. So you're going to keep seeing the right side of my face as I pivot my head left to read the chat. And whatever it is that that I do on my screen, you'll see. If I end up using a keyboard shortcut, because I have keyboard shortcut habits, I'll try to say out loud what I'm doing since you can't see it. The first thing that I wanted to cover today, just to touch on our new live streaming with QLab guide. I wrote this at the end of last week while we were realizing that live streaming with QLab was going to probably be a new topic for a lot of people starting right away. You can find it on our website, which is qlab.app, qlab.app, under documentation, in the how-to section, how to live stream with QLab. And the reason I wanted to talk about that first is because that's what I'm doing right now. You're seeing my camera from my Mac through a tool called OBS, Open Broadcast Studio, and QLab can pipe video and audio into OBS as well. And that means that, for example, if you were doing a show and you wished to live stream it over the internet, you could do a layout opposite of what I'm doing right now. So right now you see QLab is taking up the majority of your screen, and I'm down there in the corner in a little box. But you could do the opposite. You could have a live camera taking up most of the display of the stream with, say, your video output from QLab down in the corner. I just wanted to describe really briefly how that works. OBS Studio is a very cool application. I'm just getting familiar with it. I have discovered that there are more than a few things that make it crash pretty much all the time. If your Mac sleeps while it's running, it crashes. And it looks like if you use the OBS version of a text queue, it will crash after it's been streaming for 2 minutes. So that's news to me as of right now, like 1 minute ago, 2 minutes ago. But other than that, it's actually a very groovy tool. The steps and the how-to is broken down into steps, so I'm just going to go through them real quick. Step 1, download and install Open Broadcaster software. And I'll put the documentation that I'm referring to here on screen. You can get OBS Studio from obsproject.com. I'm going to put that in the chat now. if you're running a complicated show, you might have video and audio on 2 different Macs. If that's so, it is easiest to put OBS on the same Mac that's running video. If you're using, of course, only one Mac, then that's where OBS goes. So the main window of OBS looks like this. The upper area is referred to as the canvas in their documentation, but essentially what it is what OBS is broadcasting. So it's it works a little bit like a combination of the Surface Editor and the Audition window in QLab. This area is labeled Scenes, and we're not really going to talk about scenes very much because the idea of scenes is that you can have different combinations of looks and cut between them. That's sort of outside the realm of what we're trying to do when we live stream from QLab. You basically want OBS to just sit still and show the world your show. So we're not going to talk about scenes too much. Sources is the big part of this setup. Sources is where you tell OBS what is coming into OBS and therefore going out to the live stream. So I have right now the stream that you're seeing, I have 6 sources. One is called Badge, and it's this graphic down here in the lower left corner. The next is called FaceTime Camera, and that is the camera that you're seeing me with. The next is called Surface One Input, and that's the one that's going to be bringing video from QLab into OBS, which I'll demonstrate in a moment. The next source is called MacBook Pro Screen, and that is pulling the desktop from my laptop screen into OBS. And then the next is called Mic In, and that's grabbing audio from the microphone plugged into my audio interface. And then the last one is called Audio In from QLab, and that's how the cues in QLab will play audio into OBS, as well as into the speakers in the theater. I mean, not really right now, I'm not in the theater, but in our imagination. The next section here is called the audio mixer. It gives you a very rudimentary level control and some level meters so that you can see that audio is coming in correctly. The next section is scene transitions, which shows you how OBS will behave when you switch between scenes. For instance, right now, if I had several scenes here, if I switch between them, it'll crossfade over 300 milliseconds. Again, we're not talking about scenes much, so I'm not going to talk about transitions much. And then the controls are on the side. There's a button to start streaming, and when you click that, you start streaming, and it turns into a stop streaming button. You can click it to stop. You click this button to start recording. You click this button to switch to studio mode, which is a change in interface that also is not really of concern to us. It really only makes sense to use studio mode when you've got lots of scenes. So we're going to skip over that. Next is settings. Next is exit. Exit, I want to call your attention to, if you click the exit button, OBS quits right away. So don't do that during your show, is my advice. Okay, the next step after you've got OBS Studio downloaded is to download and install Soundflower. Soundflower is an old piece of software. It's been around for a while, and it's sort of on life support now, but it actually is being supported slowly but surely, and only when necessary. So it works. I'm using the most recent version of macOS on my MacBook Pro, and it works fine. It works back at least to macOS 10.10, possibly earlier. And what Soundflower does is it creates a imaginary, sort of a virtual audio interface inside your computer for taking audio out of one application and putting it into another. So it's kind of like the digital equivalent of taking a cable and plugging it into your headphone jack and then routing it back around into your mic jack, which is ridiculous. And so that's why we have this program. I'm not going to go through the directions to install Soundflower because they're a little finicky, because Soundflower needs to bypass a little bit of Mac OS's security in order to install. In the document, I lay this out, but just briefly, bypassing that security doesn't open a door that stays open. It's just a temporary bypass while you install it, and then all the security things that you have to skip over continue to be in effect after you've finished installing. So you don't need to worry about installing Soundflower and then being susceptible to all kinds of problems forever and ever. So you need Soundflower installed. What's next? Step 3, QLab video output. Okay, so this is where the rubber hits the road. And first I'm going to talk for a minute about Siphon and what Siphon is, because if you're not familiar with it, it can be a little difficult to see what I'm talking about. Siphon is a lot like Soundflower, but for video. The way Siphon works is when QLab or any other video program is playing video back, it takes the video file, it decodes it into memory, and then starts and then uses that decoded information to send to either a projector or a display or wherever you're sending the video to play. And what Siphon does is it says, that spot where it's sitting in memory, decoded, let's make that spot available to anyone who wants to look at it. So if I have QLab playing a video, and then I say, make this available via Siphon, another program can look at that video that QLab's playing, but it doesn't actually take very much extra processing power because the heavy work of decoding is only being done once. And then everyone else is able to go and look at that decoded video and say, oh, look at that. I'll draw those pixels also. So it's very powerful. And QLab uses Siphon internally in several ways. And when you tell a video surface to use Siphon, all you're doing is saying, hey, that Siphon you're using, QLab, let's let people outside QLab see it too. People, programs outside QLab. So I'm going to demonstrate hands-on now. I'm in QLab. I'm going to go to Workspace settings here. I'm going to click the little gear icon. I'm going to go to Video. And then Surface 1 is my video surface for this show. I didn't name it very imaginatively. When I click Edit, I get the video surface editor. And here you see screens assigned, Siphon, mirrors full surface. If I didn't already have it there, Nick Rose in the chat, programs are people too. Yes, thank you, Nick. Appreciate it. If I didn't already have Siphon, I could click this plus button, and that's where I'd add it right there. Now, presumably, if you're adapting an existing show, you already have a screen assigned to your surface, for example, your projector. So you would just be adding Siphon on top of that projector. And all Siphon has no settings within QLab. It just always shows the whole surface out to Siphon, end of story. So once you've got this checked and it's displayed up there in that list, you're good there. And then Surface 1, the name Surface 1 is going to matter. If it were named something else, keep track of that name instead of Surface 1. But mine is called Surface 1. Okay, I'm going to close this. I'm going to close this. Over in OBS, in Open Broadcasting Studio, I'm going to skip ahead. I'm coming back to this, I promise. Where are we? Over in Open Broadcasting Studio, in the Sources section, I added a new Siphon input. And then the properties for that Siphon input pop up automatically when I create the new input. And see, it lets me choose QLab Surface 1. I took this screenshot when I had a second surface also as a demonstration, but it's not important that there's two in this screenshot and only one in my current setup. And that's kind of it. That's the trick. That's how video comes out of QLab and into OBS. So if I were to create a video queue, I'm going to assign some media. Where do I have? Oh, it does this very frustrating thing where I had to restart my computer, and so I lost track of my most recent, most recently opened folder. All right, but here we go. So I've got some media now, clouds at sunset. I'll go to time and loops and loop that infinitely so that I don't have to worry about it running out after 30 seconds. I go to display in geometry and assign it to surface 1. It says no screens here. You saw in the video surface editor I had no screens assigned, but I did have siphon assigned. And so when I assign surface 1, even though it has no screens, QLab knows that the queue doesn't have to be broken because siphon counts as an output. Now when I hit go on this queue, you should see right above me the output of the surface. Oh, yep, there it is, that lovely sunset cloud video. In OBS, in the canvas view, I just dragged the QLab surface source wherever I wanted and resized it. So I sized it down to pretty small and right above my face, but that's just my choice here. If you wanted to place it in the middle of your picture or at the top or wherever you want to place it, at whatever scale you want to place it, it's up to you. Someone in the chat has asked for the link to the tutorial document. There it is. Alrighty. We downloaded OBS. We installed Soundflower, set that aside. We got our surface to output to siphon. I've shown that you can now, I've shown what the results look like. I'm going to hit stop on this now. I've shown what the results look like. Let's continue with the tutorial document. Step 4 is to set up QLab audio output. Now this gets kind of tangly. But I'm going to wait because someone's got a good question. If your current surface has different dimensions or an origin offset, will those affect the siphon output? This is a great question. The siphon output always shows the full rectangle of your surface. It does not show geometry correction, and it doesn't show masks. So the siphon output is sort of most ideally suited for when you are using minimal trickery and cleverness for your video output. If you have it doesn't matter what dimensions it is, siphon will handle, this will handle any sort of size that QLab can handle, which is up to about 11,000 pixels by 11,000 pixels. We had to pick a number. That's the number we picked. Much bigger than that, and you run out of video RAM really quick on a lot of Macs. So the trouble is, though, if you're using lots of clever geometry correction, if you're using it aesthetically, not just to correct for an awkwardly placed projector, you won't see that geometry correction in the siphon feed. Does that make sense? So that's a little bit of a gotcha on this. Something that I like to say a lot when I'm teaching QLab classes is that the only way to know for sure how a particular video setup works is to try it, which feels like a cop-out to me, but it is true. Testing and trying is what is necessary, particularly for video, because generally speaking, I say that for video and not audio because we can get the fastest Mac on the planet, and without too much difficulty, we can overwhelm it with video. The fastest Mac on the planet these days is hard to overwhelm with audio, but it's still possible with video, although Apple's new Mac Pro is really making that increasingly challenging to overwhelm. But I don't know about you, that's a little too expensive for me, so we're sticking with normal priced Macs. In the chat, Naomi asked, can you do this the opposite way? Can you send a live stream video from the web and run it into QLab? The answer is Basically, yes. And it's also done with Siphon. You can use Siphon as an input source for QLab. Camera cues can use Siphon as a source. The hard part is getting the live stream from a web page into Siphon, because I've only encountered one web browser that has Siphon output built in. It's an open source project called Ceph with Siphon. I'm going to type that out. Trouble is, it hasn't been updated in years and years, and I don't think it works correctly anymore. It's based on Chrome, and it's not up to date. I've used a program called Siphoner, which basically, instead of having Siphon built into the website, the web browser, Siphoner lets you designate a rectangle on your screen and say, those pixels, bring them into Siphon. It can work. It's a hassle. And not to mention that using a live stream from the web, feeding it into QLab, means that suddenly the success of your QLab project is predicated on the stability of YouTube and of your internet connection, which is something I, for one, would be antsy about. I'd much rather have something pre-recorded. Obviously, I recognize that you wouldn't ask about this if you weren't trying to do exactly this. So I'm not trying to tell you not to, just that it introduces this new set of variables. Alrighty. Good questions. Thank you. The tangly audio we talked about. So most of the time when you play cues in QLab, audio cues in a theater, the idea is that you're totally welcome, Naomi. You are sending cues to one or more speakers. I set up in my imagination a 8-channel output here, where I have a house left, house right, and center main set of speakers, subwoofer output, house left and house right surround speakers to the left and right of my audience, and house left and house right rear speakers. You watching this may all have different experience, but in my experience, this 8-channel setup is a fairly commonly used approach. Different designers will have different little variations, but many, many times I've walked into theaters to work and found that this is the basic plan. So that's my simulation here. So let's say that this is 8 speakers spread around the theater. When the audience is in the theater, they hear sound coming from all those 8 speakers, and hopefully they're not thinking about the distinct speaker. They're just thinking, well, they're thinking about the play, and then they just hear sound in support of it. What we're trying to do then is figure out, if we're live streaming a show, how do we maintain those sounds to those speakers live for the cast to hear and for anyone who might be in the theater. But then we also want to pipe all that output into OBS to broadcast to the internet. So what we're going to do is we're going to make what's called an aggregate audio device. An aggregate audio device is an Apple term for a virtual audio device that kind of glues more than one audio interface together. So the 8-channel USB connected box that I've got piping audio to these 8 speakers is going to get connected via an aggregate device to Soundflower to add another 2 channels onto the device, so that from QLab's perspective, it will be a single 10-channel device. The 8 channels of my USB interface, and then the 2 channels from Soundflower. And you see that I've already got it patched here, but I'm going to walk you through how I got there. I'm going to open Audio MIDI Setup, which you can get to by Applications, Utilities. This is a program that comes on every Mac. And in Audio MIDI Setup, the interface has changed slightly over the years. So I'm on, I'm on Mac OS 10.15.3. If you are on a different version, you might see this interface looking slightly different, but it's basically the same thing. You got a list of all the devices connected to your Mac on the left. So for instance, my external monitor has has speakers in it, so it appears. Got an audio interface built into my Thunderbolt dock. And actually, you see here is one device, 0 ins, 2 outs. That's the headphone jack on the Thunderbolt dock. And the second device is 2 ins, 0 outs. That's the microphone jack. They're technically separate devices. Pain in the neck. The iConnect Audio 4 is my 8 output interface that I'm using in QLab. Soundflower here has 2 devices that it installs, a 2 in, 2 out device and a 64 in, 64 out device. The reason it installs those 2 is basically it gives you a low channel count, low memory usage option, or a high channel count, high memory usage option. Since we're piping via stereo to the internet, we're only going to use the 2-channel version. So I created this aggregate device by clicking the plus button and choosing Create Aggregate Device. And when that happened, it gave me this, with this nice white plus sign and a blue circle. And then when you select the aggregate device, it shows you a list of all your devices, and all you need to do is tick the box for each device you want assigned to the aggregate device. Here is a weirdly important thing. You have to tick the box for your audio interface first. So whenever the aggregate device is created, start by just unchecking all these boxes. Then tick the box for your audio interface, and then after that, tick the box for Soundflower. Untick drift correction. I forgot to do that earlier. Drift correction, for you clocking nerds out there, drift correction basically simulates having a word clock connection between the 2 devices. The plus to drift correction is that your 2 devices stay in tight sync. The minus is that if they drift correction can cause audible clicks and pops. The reason we don't want drift correction is because the iConnect Audio 4 Plus, or whatever audio device you're using, is for audio in the room, and Soundflower is for audio over the internet. Since no one is going to really be listening to both of those at the same time, they don't have to be perfectly tightly synchronized. And we don't like the clicks and pops, so we take off drift correction. The reason you need to tick the box for your interface first and then Soundflower is because the order of inputs and outputs is based on the order of ticking boxes. And these 8 outputs here in QLab are outputs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And when you create this aggregate, you're adding outputs 9 and 10. You do not want to make yourself go around and reassign all these and say 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Instead, you want to leave these as 1 through 8 and add the Soundflower 2 channels on the end. Order of operations. Who knew? Okay. So once this is all set, all you got to do is tick these 2 boxes in the right order, untick these boxes, end of story. You could name the aggregate device if you wanted, Susan or whatever. I'm just going to leave it called aggregate device. Back over in QLab, my audio output patch here is aggregate audio device. The way that I set that, again, Workspace settings, audio, audio patch 1, aggregate device instead of my interface, which is iConnect Audio 4. So I just chose aggregate device. And when I click Edit Patch 1 and look at device routing, the device routing tab, if you're not already familiar with it, can be a slightly perplexing place to be. I'm going to go briefly over what this tab is for, because here's the tangly bit I talked about before. Every row in this grid represents one of the Q outputs in QLab. The Q outputs are the columns in the Audio Levels tab. So you can think of those as where audio comes out of Qs and into like the output stage of QLab. That's a metaphor. It's not literal. Don't worry. Don't get into the technical meaning of that. It's a metaphor. The columns in this grid represent the actual outputs of my audio device. Before I connected Siphon up to my iConnect Audio 4 as of Aggregate, this grid had only 8 columns because my iConnect Audio 4 has 8 outputs. And so house left main, my Q output, connected to output number 1, which connected to a socket on the back of my audio interface, which connected to a cable, which went to my house left main speaker. House right main goes to output 2, center main to output 3. So audio comes from the Qs here and goes to the outputs here. When I add Soundflower in and add another 2 channels onto my audio device, now I have 2 more columns, outputs 9 and 10. These 2 outputs are, I can think of them as going to OBS left, going to OBS right. So what I want to do is send my house left main not only to output 1, which is going to the cable to my speaker, but I also want to send it to output 9, which is the left side of my streaming output. Is there anyone who would like me to say that again or use different words? I don't want to call anyone out, but you should definitely ask me to repeat that because that is the confusing part. Likewise, house right main, in addition to going to output 2, is going to output 10. All right. So my device outputs, 1 through 8, represent physical connections on the back of my audio interface. And if, well, I might be able to pick it up. I can't quite pick up my device and show it to you, but 1 through 8 represent 8 sockets on the back that are actual 1/4-inch jacks. 9 and 10 are the virtual outputs that got added on with Soundflower. House left main represents it, which is Q output number 1, represents all the audio coming from all my Qs routed to this slider. So all the audio from all my Qs going to this slider comes into this grid on this row. Before I started this whole routine, I then used this cross point to route it out of device output number 1, the physical socket number 1 on the back of my interface. Now that I've glued on my additional Soundflower outputs, I also want that same audio to go to Soundflower output left, which is going to go to my streaming software. Someone asked if this can be done using Dante Virtual Sound Card. The answer is yes, just as someone else helpfully jumped in. Dante Virtual Sound Card does a wonderful job of doing the following. As far as the Mac is concerned, Dante is a physical sound card. Dante is a box with 64 sockets on the back going wherever you like. So if we were doing this with DVS, we'd be in a little pickle because QLab only supports 64 outputs. So if you are doing a show that uses Dante and it uses all 64 Dante outputs, this technique won't work, and I'll have to think about a solution for making it work. Something's not coming to me right off the top of my head. If you have DVS dialed down to use fewer outputs, then this exact whole thing works because you can glue on another 2 outputs via Soundflower. Okay. So I've got house left main going to my device output number 1, which is going to my speakers. I've now also routed it to device output 9, which is Soundflower. House right main goes to output 2 and to Soundflower. Center main goes to my 3rd output, which maybe goes to my center speaker, and then also goes to both 9 and 10 because when the listeners at home listen to a sound cue coming through the center, I want them to hear it centered, which is left and right in equal balance. This is where you tinker for a while, days before your show, to get a mix here that simulates your in-theater mix to your own satisfaction. Essentially what we're doing here is we're building a stereo mix down, like a headphone mix of our whole show, and feeding that headphone mix out of 9 and 10. 9 and 10 is then going into our broadcasting software. Mike Post has asked, could you think of the rows as tracks in a file labeled strings and percussions and horns? You could, except that this is not about inputs from a file and outputs. It's about inputs. It's about outputs from cues and physical outputs to devices. So this grid and this grid over here in the audio levels tab are two separate grids. Here, each row represents a channel of audio in the file, in the source file. Clouds at Sunset, as it happens, has only 2 channels, but it could have up to 24 channels of audio built in. These columns are the cue outputs going into the left side of this matrix. So if row 1 were, as Mike says, strings, and row 2 were percussion, in my cue I have a string channel, a percussion channel. If the strings went to house left mains and house right mains and center mains, we'd hear strings on this row, and this row. Does that answer your question, Mike? Perhaps? Going back, so we've created this mix down, this headphone mix, this stereo representation. Again, this is something to tinker with and try and make a recording of your output and then listen to it later. And if you like what you hear, then you set it up right. So we've got this set up. Notice, as we look back in the audio levels tab, I don't see any more columns here. I've left my visible channels at 8 because these are cue outputs. I don't care about device outputs when I'm looking at my cue list. I only care about cue outputs. Device outputs happen here. Okay, so now I've routed that, and I'm going to close this window. Once you've made that rerouting that we just looked at, the nice part is you don't need to adjust any of your cues. All of your cues continue to play as they ever did. As far as I'm aware, OBS only streams 2-channel audio. I think your options are mono and stereo. I haven't been able to attempt to stream high channel count. I don't know enough about it. I've only been working with OBS for 2 days now. But I believe it's really the streaming service that's the limiting factor. And as far as I can tell, YouTube is part of Google's war on user interface. And so I can't ever find any buttons or switches for anything. It's enraging to me. But I believe that the streaming software would have to support a higher channel count. And then, the streaming service. And then you'd have to figure out how to implement that. Something I can stand to learn about. Okay, now we have a cue. It's a video cue. We've routed our audio and our video. We've created a aggregate audio device. We did this routing in the device routing tab. And then we have to set up we set up the video input in OBS already. Now we need to set up the audio input in OBS. You go down to the sources palette, you click the little plus, and it gives you audio input. What you're looking for is new audio input capture is the name. And then the properties window comes up automatically right away, and you choose Soundflower as the source for that audio input. And that's it. Just as we chose Siphon, QLab, Surface 1, and the video comes in, we choose Soundflower, and then anything that QLab supplies into Soundflower, OBS receives. So I can create an audio cue, set its target, and I'm going to turn this down quite a lot, just in case. You folks should hear that peppy little piano and someone singing about Hamlet. So now we've streamed video and we've streamed audio. Dan tells us in the chat that OBS can stream surround, so that's great. That confirms my thesis then that what you need to do is make sure that your streaming service can receive multi-channel audio. Thanks everyone for confirming. I appreciate you. So that's, I'm going to leave that as an exercise for the reader, how to get surround working. Needless to say, if you wanted to use more outputs, you could use, instead of Soundflower 2 channel, you could use Soundflower 64 channel. If you had, then, you know, the last number of channels above 64 total would be truncated because QLab only supports 64 outputs. So thank you, everybody. So streaming surround clearly is technically possible. That's something for you to learn more about if you feel like it. That's really it. You've heard streaming audio, you've heard streaming video. Voila. So that's the part of this document that I really wanted to go over in this chat with some Q&A. I'd like to open the floor to any questions on any subject in QLab. It could be about what we talked about already, or it could be about something else. I've already gotten a request to talk about OSC and networked Macs. I'm interested to know a little bit more about what this person means when they say networked Macs. I mean, it can mean a lot of things. But I will talk briefly about sending OSC from QLab. OSC stands for Open Sound Control. It was dreamed up by some crazy folks at Berkeley who decided that MIDI needed a sequel. Now, someone else is working on something called MIDI 2, and it sounds promising, but it doesn't exist yet. Or if it exists, it's not finalized yet. But OSC is a bit of a misnomer. It's not only used for sound. It's an open-ended kind of control architecture. Many audio and video hardware and software devices use OSC or allow you to use OSC to control them, QLab among them, but also lighting, notably ETC's EOS family has a comprehensive OSC control. So to send an OSC message from QLab, you use the network queue. The network queue allows you to send a message. So to send, for example, if I send that message to another copy of QLab on another computer, and that copy of QLab is running a workspace that has a queue with queue number 10, when it receives this message, Q10 will start. Routing the message is, I imagine, the thing that the individual was asking about. So I'm going to talk about workspace settings to get you ready to send your messages to different devices. Let's get rid of that screen. Don't need it anymore. You click the gear to get to workspace settings. You go to network. And here you have as of QLab 4.6, you can have any number of patches that you want. A patch being a set of like settings that go together. So if I have, for example, reason to send OSC messages from QLab to itself, I might call this me, and it sends to the local host, meaning this Mac. Port 53000 is where QLab listens for OSC. But if I also want to send messages to another copy of QLab on another Mac on the computer, as we were just talking about, I might name it whatever I like, and I need to know the IP address of that other computer. So if I've set up a local network, maybe I've set up using the address scheme where this Mac here has 192.168.0.5, and the other Mac is 192.168.0.6. And I know that that is the IP address of the other computer. Port 53000 is necessary because that's the port that QLab listens for OSC messages on. When I have that patch ready, I can return to my queue list set the destination of this network queue to other Mac, and now this message will go to the other Mac when I press send as to preview it, or press go when the queue is standing by. For example, I can also send messages to, if I want to send messages to lights, I think the command don't quote me on this exact message. I think this is right. EOS 1 fire 10 means, hey, it's an EOS console on queue list 1, fire Q10. I might be exactly right, not be exactly right on that message. It's something like that. It's very similar to that. And then I would need to create a patch for my EOS console, and maybe that's some other destination. I need to know its IP address, and I need to know its port number. EOS consoles, you can set your own port number to whatever you like. So I think the default is 8,000, but you can set it differently if you need it to be set differently. Dan Cantlin asks, is there a way to edit levels in multiple fade? Adam Taylor, thank you. EOS Q, I was so close, wasn't I? EOS Q110 fire. Excellent. And then you go to the EOS console. Dan asked, is there a way to edit multiple fade commands simultaneously like you can for standard audio cues? So the question is, if I have 3 fade cues, fade music, fade birds, fade wind. I'm using the command key and arrow keys to flip between tabs on the inspector, by the way. So if I want to fade my music up to this level, my birds to that level, my wind to this level, I'm assuming that Dan is asking, can I select all these cues, holding down the Apple key, the command key, and clicking on them all, and editing them all at once? The answer is no, not right now. Batch editing fade cues, audio levels in fade cues is a complex thing to do, because so many fade cues selected could be doing so many different things. Speaking for myself, I have created a script which lets you adjust the master output level of a batch of selected audio or video or fade cues by an amount. I recommend visiting that documentation page again. If you go down to examples, you'll see Sam's toolbox, and I'll put a link right now into the chat. This allows me to batch edit audio levels even in fade cues. So I can select all these, type my little keyboard shortcut, and then type, say, +5, and then all those fades are bumped up 5 dB from where they were. What is up with Yorick Björnesson? Yorick Björnesson, he's a big bear in the Golden Compass. He's awesome. Yorick Björnesson is the name of the hard drive in my Mac. When I got this Mac, I had just been watching the HBO series, and I like to give my Macs whimsical names. And this thing was powerful and sleek and silver, and he's powerful and sleek and silver. So, I called it Yorick Björnesson. It is not anything more significant than that. How is future support of AppleScript going to be? Apple is less and less supporting it, says Eric. Well, I am not sure where you have drawn that conclusion from. I have not drawn the same conclusion. That doesn't mean that you're wrong. It doesn't mean that I'm right. But my assessment is not that Apple has supported AppleScript any less. The signals that I look for to see that Apple is supporting something less is that they deprecate it officially, Sometimes they'll say, for example, that a particular method that we use to draw a window in, or to draw a button or to access a menu, that method is no longer going to be available in the future. It's deprecated. Please stop using it and transition to using this other method. I haven't seen any signs of that from AppleScript. The other thing I look for is, does Apple stop including something in their own software? So Final Cut Pro is not brilliantly AppleScriptable, but it is AppleScriptable. Logic is AppleScriptable. I still see Automator is just sort of a fancy shell on top of AppleScript, largely. So I have seen the latest version of Mac OS did not kill Automator or Script Editor. Those tools still work. So to my eye, AppleScript is still well supported. That said, the language is a pain in the neck, and it's irritating to use. So it's not entirely ridiculous to imagine that Apple would stop supporting it and start doing something a little bit less of a pain in the neck. For now, as long as they don't show any signs of not supporting AppleScript, Chris is my boss, and he's in the chat, so I'll let him say whether this is true or not, that as long as Apple doesn't stop supporting AppleScript, our plan is not to stop supporting AppleScript. I think that's a reasonable guess. Let's see here. Have I missed any questions? I don't think I have. What else do people want to ask, if anything? I'm looking at my notes to see what people have asked. I answered those questions, or I tried to. Peter has asked us, is there a way to use QLab lighting with a visualizer? Okay, good questions coming in. Okay, great. I'm gonna answer Peter's question first about visualizers. And the answer is yes, and it involves a few steps. Capture, let's see here. I'm gonna go back to the website, to our education section, to the QLab Cookbook. In the QLab Cookbook, most of which, 99% of which was written by Mick Poole, who is, if you are not familiar with Mick Poole's work, then the briefest overview is that he's a very capable designer and also is very curious about doing weird and clever things with QLab. So the cookbook is an example of weird and clever things that he's come up with to do in QLab. Some of these things are sort of purely interesting, sort of from an intellectual perspective, and and not necessarily the most practical, but most of them have at least a practical use that at least no more than one step removed. Many of them have a practical use immediately. I'm trying to find the visualizer demo that he has here, but I'm having trouble finding it. I may not have brought it in because it may, yeah, I did not import this visualizer yet because it was difficult enough that I had a hard time making it work correctly when I was editing these for this website. So the answer in short is that yes, QLab outputs ArtNet and Capture Sweden can accept ArtNet input. So you can set up Capture Sweden to listen to the ArtNet output from QLab and work as a visualizer. It takes a lot of steps, enough steps that I was hesitant to import that tutorial into our new publishing of the cookbook. But I think that QLabCookbook.com still exists. Yes, QLabCookbook.com. And here, where does he have it? Wait, is this it? Nope. That's about doing a follow spot with video. And it's in here somewhere. We're going to find it. We're going to find it. Here we go. There's 218 and 220. And 221 are all relating. So I'm going to paste these in now to the chat. That's one. That's another. And a third. So in short, those are all relating to using QLab with visual lighting visualizers. This is not my area of expertise, but it sounds like this seems like something folks would like me to learn more about so that I can teach about. So consider it on my list, and I'll try to develop a better understanding of these topics for a future tutorial. The next question, let's see, I'm going back over the questions that were asked earlier. We had a question about triggering light cues to sound. We have let me answer some faster questions first. Were you thinking of implementing an interactive shader format? I don't want to speculate on what we're going to do in the future for sure. I will say this, QLab 5 is in development, and we are always looking to improve QLab's feature set and QLab's performance. And a lot of what QLab does for video is sort of on the table for being re-explored and adjusted and modernized, because lots of things have happened in the world of video since QLab 4 was released, and we want QLab 5 to sort of embrace what's new and what's possible today. So I don't know about ISF specifically, but it'll be in the mix of things we talk about. Mike Post asks, trying to wrap my head around the math to determine how much memory a video stream needs from a GPU. For instance, 1024 by 768 pixels with 16-bit or 24-bit color takes how much memory? I don't even kind of know the answer to that, I'm sorry to say. I know that that OBS will show you your bit rate, and it will dynamically adjust bit rate as needed by varying compression. So like right now I'm streaming at 2,645 kilobits per second, but that number has been varying. It's been going up and down from about 2,000 to about 3,000. And that, this whole time I've been hearing the fan going on my MacBook, but I don't really know much more about it than that. I guess that's another thing I need to learn. Anthony Narciso asks, my Spotlight looks different from the normal version. Oh yeah, when I type command space, it doesn't look like Spotlight like you're used to. You're used to this, right? I'm using a program called Alfred, which is a Spotlight replacement and much more. It's pretty geeky. The reason I use it is because it gives me it basically gives me a little terminal to do some shortcuts to like rearrange windows or launch groups of applications. Alfred.app, it's very cool. I recommend it. I'm pasting it into the chat. Will QLab ever have some kind of record function that will allow QLab to take a DMX input and record an existing cue from a console, asks the Orig Mac. And the answer to that is maybe. I understand why it would be cool. And again, it's on the very long list. The very long list is currently about 4,000 items long. So for every feature, we just have to decide, is this the most important thing to do next or not? And that's a really hard decision to make. and we wrestle with it every time we discuss a new release. But recording DMX input is obviously useful, so it is definitely on the list, and hopefully we'll get to it sooner rather than later. Okay, I'm going to go back to how do we trigger light cues to sound. Now, person who asked that question, can you tell me, Nick Rose, is Alfred okay to use during a show, or is it a hog like Spotlight? It's okay to use during a show. It uses the Spotlight database, but if you tell Spotlight not to index, which is what we recommend doing, then it won't index, and Alfred won't make it index. I would like the person who asked about triggering light cues from sound. Are you talking about triggering light cues within QLab, using QLab's own lighting tools? Or are you talking about triggering light cues on an external device like an EOS or an Ion or a Grand MA or whatever? While that person's responding, Eric said, I'm thrilled to hear about QLab 5. It sounds super interesting. I am glad, and just to shut down the speculation, I am not going to be talking about what QLab 5 will or won't have in it, nor will I be talking about a release date. We're early enough in the history of QLab 5 that I can say comfortably we don't have a release date. But when we do have a release date, we generally don't set it firmly until like a week in advance, because we would rather keep our release date shifty in order to match our development structure. So if we're working towards a release and then we discover, you know what, if we spend an extra week, then we will get this advantage. So let's push it a week. We don't like to say a date and then pull that date. So that's why we avoid saying dates at all. So that's all I'll talk about QLab 5. Looking more, still waiting to hear about the person who asked about triggering light cues from sound, whether they mean within QLab or an external lighting console. While I wait for that, I'll keep looking through other questions. We have, for using iOS devices as camera inputs, do you recommend Epic Cam or other applications, or any more reliable than other? I have done this a good amount. I have what I think is a completely foolproof setup. Knock on wood, nothing's foolproof. I have had good success with the following setup. Thing one, I get a good Wi-Fi router. I keep it disconnected from the internet. I connect my Mac to the Wi-Fi router over Ethernet, and I put the Wi-Fi router as close to the stage as possible. That's step one. Step two, software. On the iOS devices, I install a program called AirBeam Pro. AirBeam Pro is on the App Store. It costs like $5 or $6. It might actually just be called AirBeam on the iOS side, and it streams over the local network to the AirBeam Pro app, which is a receiver. So, iPhone running AirBeam on the Wi-Fi network, no other devices on the Wi-Fi network. Then the Wi-Fi network, the Wi-Fi access point is connected with Ethernet over to my Mac. My Mac has AirBeam Pro, which is another $5 or $6, also on the App Store. It receives that video, and then it creates a siphon server. And then the siphon server is available to QLab as a source for camera cues. I'm going to show you. Let's get rid of those. Actually, those two. In settings, in video, in camera patches, you see here that you see QLab Surface 1 is available because we told Surface 1 you're going to be a siphon output. So any siphon server on your Mac is available as an input for a camera patch. So when you've got AirBeam Pro running, it becomes available for camera patches. And then you can use a camera cue to display the output of the camera on the iOS device. I have done 3 iPhones streaming, what did I stream at? SD, black and white, 30 frames per second simultaneously, and I got smooth playback from all 3. It was really cool, so for a dance show. Question, is there any plan on adding a selected cue definition to the AppleScript dictionary to be able to refer to a selected cue to stop or start it, to avoid using OSC for that purpose? I do not know. That is a good question. I think that might be the first request for that. So, Alejandro, I will add that to our list of feature requests. Thank you for that. It's a good question. I mean, a good request. Thank you. Now I'm catching up in the chat to see what other people are asking. Queuing lights from sound for dance. Having problems getting QLab to trigger the older ETC expression. Oh, ETC expression. Good for you. I love the expression. The expression was a great console. I loved using it. I missed it when I stopped using it. Okay, so queuing lights from sound for dance. So here we go. There are, to trigger an expression specifically, you need to be using MIDI. And figuring out which MIDI messages the expression wants for its triggers is outside my scope. It's been a while since I've used the expression, and when I did, I was not doing clever, fancy stuff with MIDI. So, in short, you create a MIDI cue. We are going to create this dummy MIDI cue. We're just going to say that note on, channel 1, note number 60, velocity 64. We're going to say that that's the correct message, and we already know that because we looked it up in the manual for the expression. But you're going to have to look that up yourself and figure out what MIDI message the expression wants in order to get a trigger. So let's just say it's this. Next, you're going to need to physically hook up the Mac to the expression. You want a MIDI interface on your Mac that provides a MIDI 5-pin output. You're going to connect that to the MIDI input on the expression. Sometimes you need, I think I'm trying to remember whether all expressions had built-in MIDI sockets or only some. Not 100% on that. But I'm gonna assume that you have a MIDI input socket on your expression, because otherwise there's sort of no continuing down this conversation. I do dance a lot. I love doing dance. And the way that I like to do light cues, so let's say this is LX10. I'm gonna now copy and paste. And maybe this is note 61 for LX11. Copy paste. Note 62. LX12. Okay, so let's just say we've got those 3. They do have MIDI, says Mike. Okay, great. So let's say we've just got those 3 light cues and we want to trigger them from a piece of music. So what I like to do is I create an audio cue, set up my piece of music, and then I look at the Time and Loops tab, and as I'm playing, I'm going to use the M hotkey on my keyboard, letter M, marker, to set markers. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I start playing it. And if I find a spot where I want the cue, I want it right there. And now I'm going to want it, I think, on this peak. So, go. And for my last cue, it's going there. Then, I zoom in, I look, and I see, did I miss the peak slightly? I'm going to listen again. I'm going to hit V to preview. Yeah, I wanted it on that peak exactly. So it's just there. Now I'm zooming out and zooming in. Now I'm sliding over here just to make it timed perfectly. Okay, so those markers in my audio cue, those slice markers are now exactly where I want my audio cues. That's the first thing I do. Obviously, if you have more cues, you'll do this for the whole rest of the song, but we're just going to do 3 for now. Next, I select the audio cue and all 3 MIDI cues, which represent my lighting triggers, over to the lighting console. And with these cues selected, I create a new group cue. The group cue needs to be in the timeline mode. Go to timeline mode, and the group cue becomes a timeline group cue. Timeline group cues start all their child cues simultaneously. So all the cues inside this group will start at the same time when I select this group and hit go. Obviously, that means lights 10, 11, and 12 will happen immediately at the top of the song as of right now. That's not what I want. What I want to do, though, is go into the timeline tab of the group cue. And here, I don't know how clearly this comes through in the stream, but there are 3 little green vertical lines in the audio cue, which represent those 3 markers I put in. And when I click and hold on the light cue and start dragging it left or right, you should see vertical blue lines which align with those 3 markers. Those lines are magnetic, if you will. So when I get my mouse near to the blue line, the MIDI cue snaps right to the blue line. Then I let go. So now lights 10 is perfectly aligned with that marker. I'm going to drag lights 11 and align to the next marker. Lights 12 to the 3rd marker. Et voila. The slice markers become magnetic points that my other cues can snap to as I drag. And now when I run this cue, these 3 MIDI cues, you'll see, have pre-weights that have been defined by the amount that I drag them in the timeline. If I've got a gazillion cues, I might like to have the audio cue stay at the top as I scroll up and down. So let's make a bunch more light cues. They're all going to be numbered 12 right now. Don't worry about that. Select the group. Select the audio cue, and then press this button here. This pins the audio cue to the top, and then lets me scroll around looking at all my other cues. So I can then drag this sucker over here, and then this guy over there, and then this one over here, and whatever I like. It seems that Aaron is pleased by this answer. It seems Amy is pleased by this answer as well. Okay, great. Fabulous. Yes, the Origmac tab to transcend. Yes, that would be very nice. For now, do that work in your audio editor, and remember that QLab imports markers. So if you're working in Logic and you create a bunch of markers and export, the AIFF will have all those markers you created inside. Let's see here. More questions. Some questions are really just feature requests, hidden inside questions, which is fine. That's totally fine. I'm delighted. What about NDI in QLab? Yeah, NDI seems super rad. We would love to add it. It's not just like type 2 things and it's done, so it's on the list of maybe let's weigh it against other features. But we're reading up on NDI and learning about NDI. Eric Rosales, I'd like to be able to create more reacting shows. If this, then that. Yep, that sounds like it would be cool too. Really sounds cool. Now that the cat is more than a year out of the bag about all the different colors and QLab supports for labeling cues, are there plans to add UI to select colors within QLab? I love the ability to be more granular about the color coding of my cues. Having to use OSC to set them is kind of a hassle. I hear that. You could build one workspace that did OSC commands to set the color of the selected cue as you liked. That's a, for now, answer. But having more robust color controls for cues could be pretty cool. I agree. I'm going to take a sip of juice for a moment. My throat's getting dry. Much better. Okay. Let's see here. If I video record rehearsal, I can do the same, says someone. Yes. Oh my God, yes. If you design dance, absolutely film your rehearsals, drop the film into QLab, and use it as a queuing structuring template. So valuable. I have done that many times. It's the bee's knees, as they say. Any chance to get markers from Pro Tools or Ableton Live to export? It's not our fault that Pro Tools uses a weird proprietary format for markers, and so it's not necessarily my opinion that it's our responsibility to solve that problem. But I need to learn more about whether Pro Tools, whether there's an easier way than what's currently done in Pro Tools. Right now, you have to export your audio, export a markers list, and then use another tool to merge the markers list and the audio. It's really maddening. NDI is great. What about RTMP? On the list, maybe, don't know. Is it possible to stream audio from an iPhone to QLab in 4G? I assume you mean over a cellular network. The answer is not directly in QLab. You'd have to use some external tool to get the audio into the Mac and then to get it into QLab. That is that's kind of a high intensity thing to do, and since there is no sort of facility to participate directly in a cell phone network from QLab, I think you'd need some kind of audio receiver that can listen to whatever the cell phone is sending. A link to the group discussion with the color palette has caused a weird look. Could you share the process, how we record the rehearsals and make the template if you're comfortable? Are you talking about what I was just saying about recording dance videos? This is a question from Gaurav Sharma. I hope I have pronounced that close to acceptably. Sure, great, good. Yes, so here is my approach. If I feel like I have the energy for it, I will bring my tripod and my big camera to the rehearsal, set up in the back of rehearsal room so that the edges of the stage are the edges of the frame, and then just hit record when they start running the number. I make sure that I can hear the audio in the room clearly on my camera. If I don't feel like I have time or energy, I can just grab my phone and hold it real still and film. And I just let them run the number. And when that's done, and I leave rehearsal, I take that video recording and put it on my Mac. So again, getting it off the phone is actually relatively easy. I just airdrop it straight from my camera roll onto my Mac. If I'm using my big camera, I take the SD card and stick it in my card reader and copy the file over. And then that video is a video of the dance performance. And I bring that video file into QLab as a cue. And then as the video is playing, just as I did here, instead of looking at the waveform of this audio cue, I look at the waveform section of the video cue, and I create markers just like I created here. And then I line up my cues accordingly. The trick is all of those need to be offset when I get to the actual performance, because when I hit record on my camera, maybe it was a few seconds before the choreographer hit go on the CD player in the rehearsal room. So I find out the amount of time late that my cues all are, and I subtract that amount from all my pre-weights. And I'm going to refer again to my script set that my set of scripts, Sam's Toolbox, that I shared earlier. There's a script in there that you can, I'm not sure if it's actually in there or if you can just extrapolate an Apple script that subtracts or adds the same amount from all pre-weights of all selected cues. Again, I'm sorry for pronouncing your name poorly. Did that answer your question? I hope it answered your question. And I'm sorry I just made that loud noise. Chris seconded Scott's. Yep, record Q sequence is also a great tool. Record Q sequence. I'll demonstrate how that goes. So let me rename these because it'll be a lot easier to tell. I pronounced correctly. Woohoo! Okay, record Q sequence goes like this. Let's take these out of here. The record Q sequence tool basically lets QLab watch me press go, and then it keeps track of my times between goes and turns that into a sequence. So I'm going to go to the Tools menu, Record Q Sequence. Record relative to a timeline group Q, ready to record, start recording. And then I sit there, maybe with my Mac actually in the dance rehearsal, and I watch the dancers, and I watch along and go, light Q. I'm hitting the space bar here. And now go. Oh, and then the other dancer comes along here and then jumps and go. That's a light cue. And then that's a light cue. And then the dance is over and that's my blackout. And then I press stop recording. And you see that QLab has produced a timeline group with start cues. These start cues reach out and trigger each of these MIDI cues. And the timing between these cues is exactly the time between when I press the go button. Is that making sense? I hope it's making sense. Did I explain it all right? My pre-weights remain from earlier. Yes, my pre-weights did remain from earlier. So I need to go in here, type E for edit pre-weight, 0, enter. Now all those cues have no pre-weights anymore. So now when I hit go on this group, these start cues trigger these MIDI cues according to this exact timing. Okie dokie. Unless I'm mistaken, says the OriginMac, QLab only allows you to jump to the next slice in the file. Are you talking about devamping? Yes, you're talking about devamping. Yes, all that devamping does is let you bail on a loop or create, or just basically line up an event with the next slice marker. So it doesn't let you do more sophisticated things like targeting specific slices or jumping around. That's on the list. It's on the list. Is there a way of setting universal delay on audio, video, or lighting to correct sync between them? Jared Factor asks this. The answer is no. There is not a universal delay for audio, video, or lighting built into anything. We have gotten requests before for being able to delay audio and video, one or the other, to basically delaying audio to correct for the fact that the video from QLab might be going through a video wall processor, which always adds a lot of lag. And that makes sense to us. This is the first time I've heard a request for universal lighting delay. I don't see any reason that wouldn't make sense or would be extra difficult to do. So I'm going to copy that down and call that another feature request for our list. Thank you very much. Adding number 4111. No, seriously, thank you very much. I'm trying to be funny, but I love feature requests. I really do. Orlando asks, just want to make sure this whole video along with Q&A is going to be playable here again on YouTube so we can use it as a tutorial. The answer is yes. If YouTube's built-in recording method works, great. If not, I have been recording the stream since like 1 minute in. I think you missed some of my preamble. And if YouTube's built-in recorder screws it up somehow, I'll upload that other thing. I don't know about replaying the chat, and that's why I've been doing my best to say the questions out loud as I address them. I don't know about that technology, and I don't know how it works. I've never streamed before. So I'm going to save the chat if possible, and hopefully it'll be in the stream and it'll just work. But worst case scenario, we have a recorded video from the very beginning, unless I somehow manage to mess that up. Okay. Yes, this is a record queue sequence feature is awesome. It is indeed awesome. Carlos, talking about mapping, will it be possible to feed several surfaces from the same video queue in the future? I don't know. I'm not sure. Right now, there are insert boring technical reasons for why that's a big hassle for us to build. I don't know if the new way will make it, the new way in QLab 5 will include that. I just don't know. But for now, just making a copy of a queue and playing it to 2 surfaces is a pretty quick solution. The more sophisticated you're doing, the more sophisticated your approach, the harder it is. Another thing you can do, though, is create camera queues and use surfaces to feed into the source, surfaces via siphon as the source for a camera queue, which feeds another surface. Food for thought? I don't know. We'll see. Johnny Bean says the chat will replay. The chat will replay. All right, great, awesome. And the Urge Mac says Sam's preamble went in the course of theatrical event. That's good. I like that. Okay, great. Aaron asks, to show an iPad I've hooked up on my Mac via QuickTime, I've used Cam Twist. Yep. I mentioned Siphoner. Do I recommend that instead? I recommend Siphoner when you're trying to stream off of the web on a Mac to that same Mac. Siphoner creates a region on your screen that says anything in this region will get piped into Siphon. iPads hooked up to the Mac via QuickTime with Cam Twist is a really good alternative to what I described earlier about using AirBeam. I don't recommend one or the other specifically because I have never used the iPad QuickTime Cam Twist solution myself. I've heard it described. It clearly seems to work well. So I think if you've tried that and it works for you, keep using it. For people who haven't tried anything at all, I think that AirBeam is a pretty bulletproof way to make wireless streaming from an iOS device to a Mac work well at a pretty low cost. I think Cam Twist has a slightly higher barrier of entry for getting to understand how it works than AirBeam Pro. So it really depends on your level of comfort learning new software and sort of tinkering around and trying things. But nothing in this arena for me so far is something I specifically recommend against. I haven't found anything like that. I haven't come across something where I'm like, no, that's definitely a bad idea. Don't do that. The idea of having delay for lighting, says Jared, would be particularly useful if we were able to set per unit rather than for the entire DMX output. That is a lot of a lot to take in. Let's see. You're talking about delaying the DMX output per fixture. Oof. I see why you want that. It makes sense. It seems complicated. I do not know. Do other consoles do that? Are there consoles that have a delay per device option? A Room asks, Siphon can only be used for one video source. Not sure what you mean by that. QLab has 8 camera patches, so it could take 8 Siphon inputs maximum. And Siphon itself has no limitations on the number of Siphon, they're called Siphon servers, which I find a little confusing. But the number of Siphon streams on a Mac at once, there is no hard limit. It's based on the power of your Mac. So if you're running 4 video surfaces in QLab, in your workspace, and you assign them all to Siphon, you will get 4 separate Siphon feeds of those 4 surfaces. Is there any possibility in the future we'll see an inbuilt feature in QLab to see frequency content of signals or measure the response of our system? This, I'm pretty comfortable saying outright, it is not likely. You're talking about hooking QLab into Smart or SpectraFu or some other measurement software. I think that that's probably not that likely. That feels to me to step pretty distantly outside the core feature set of QLab. And the farther afield you go when you're writing a piece of software, the easier it is to introduce bugs that you don't really know where they came from or what to do about them. I mean, I'm never going to say never for anything, but it seems like real-time analysis within QLab is something that we're not likely to add and certainly not likely to prioritize, especially because so much of the energy that we spend on QLab is about maximizing performance for the live playback of cues. And there's nothing quite like real-time analysis of multiple streams of audio to really start getting your computer working hard. Mike asked Jared if Jared is talking about compensating for dimmer curves or other quirks like that, and Jared agrees. And the answer is that dimming curves definitely is on our list. I won't promise when, but it's definitely on our list. Yeah, Chris jumps in the same. When doing presentations, now we have a question from Eric. When doing presentations, I use Keynote quite regularly. Have you come across a way to make QLab act like Siphon Monitor? I want Keynote to be piped into QLab somehow. We have gotten this request several times. I don't have a great solution for it yet. I think Siphoner, again, using Siphoner to designate a rectangle on screen that gets piped into Siphon is kind of the way. To me, this is a Keynote limitation, not a QLab limitation. What you really want is for Keynote to output to Siphon, because QLab's ready to receive that. Of course, you can also output your Keynote material, and it does a really great job of outputting slides as PNGs, and then outputting transitions as movies. So you can actually run through your Keynote deck as cues in QLab in a pretty groovy way, but it does take prep time to build it. Alrighty, it is 5:30. I am perfectly okay to keep going if people want to keep going. It seems like the number of people watching it has not changed. So if we want to keep talking for, I don't know, another 15, 20 minutes, that's fine with me. Just keep asking questions. But if the questions taper off, then I'll wrap it up. Awkward silence on the live stream. I'm sorry I'm so backlit. I just moved, and so I don't have curtains yet. And the light's been really changing all day. Mike Post asks, I remember a system from years ago for dynamic imaging of a space that worked for live reinforcement. Am I dreaming, or was there something that linked into QLab? It's possible, Mike, that you were thinking about... nope, I've lost its name. It's like Timax, and it is called... Chris, help me out. I'm losing it. Something like that. Yes, we did have a queue that was for remote control of a dynamic delay matrix hardware product, and I think 4 or 5 people bought that add-on. It was not the product was pretty groovy, but it was not hugely popular, and I don't mean to. Stage Tracker, thank you, Chris. Stage Tracker. I'm not trying to say something bad about Stage Tracker. It was very cool. It didn't really seem to catch on, and so we don't have that right now. We do have a pretty tight integration with D&B's Soundscape processor, the DS100, and that's something that we can talk about if you like. Aaron asks, no, that's not a question. Nick Rose asks, how's Rocket? Rocket is my dog. He is not in the room at the moment. He's doing great. He's getting used to the new house. Lots of new smells. Lots of new things to bark at. So it's a period of adjustment, but he's doing well. Asked about a tentative release date for QLab 5. The official release date of QLab 5 is the future. That is when we will be releasing QLab 5. Questions here. Seeing as you're encouraging feature requests, it would be great to have a group type that is basically like a slideshow. That makes sense. That is a good request. We have that one already in the list. So consider your request filed. Scott asks, given that Apple seems to be deprecating Quartz Composer, are you looking into alternatives such as I don't know how to say this word. VUO. It's a Quartz Composer-like program. VUO? I don't know. The answer is yes. Not Apple has formally deprecated Quartz Composer. QLab 5 will not support Quartz Composer. And we recognize that what people are doing with Quartz Composer in QLab now needs to be replaced with something. And we don't know what that'll be, and we don't know how much of it will be available on day one. But we are committed to exploring it and doing our best to replicate that current feature set and hopefully shedding some of the bad things about Quartz Composer, some of the frustrating things. I don't know specifically about VUO, but whatever it is that we use, is going hopefully to be a good replacement. Thanks for this great live stream, says studiolumumba.com. When will you do it again? We are doing another live stream at 1 p.m. on Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. For reference, right now it's 5:36 p.m. my time. So at 1 p.m. my time on Thursday, right here on QLab.tv, we will be doing another stream. And if it is largely the same folks, basically I'm going to ask at the beginning, do people want me to go through the live streaming doc again or not? And if people do want me to go through the live stream doc, I will. And then for all of you, if you want to join again and don't care about that part, you can just join up about half an hour in. I've been gone from using QLab for a while. Is there a resource to help me catch up? That's a great question. I think that it really depends on how you learn, right? Everybody learns differently. And some people learn well by watching and listening. Some people learn well by laying their hands on and doing. Some people learn well by reading. The QLab manual is pretty extensive. And my strong encouragement is that the best way, if you find yourself able to learn well by reading, download a copy of QLab and download and open the manual in a web browser and look at the manual and play with QLab at the same time. That's my best recommendation, given no other parameters. I mean, if there are experienced QLab users in your social circle, hit them up for sure. If there is a theater nearby that uses QLab that you can go hang around during tech rehearsal, that can be a great way. I've had students attend a tech rehearsal where I was programming QLab. They just sort of sat in the row behind me. And then whenever I was sitting back from the keyboard, they'd lean up and say like, hey, what'd you do over there? How'd you do that one thing? That can be a really great way to do it. Cam McBain says, any thoughts that QLab may develop a function to animate fades by drawing a path, making it easy to develop surround sound effects within QLab? Wouldn't that be cool? Is what I'll say today. Jared says, deprecating Quartz Composer, ? Sadly, it is true. Quartz Composer will soon be gone. If you rely on it, now is the time to learn what else is out there and see what you can do. Earlier we spoke about signals that Apple gives when they're deprecating something or going to stop supporting something. They've given every signal that there is that they are done with Quartz Composer. Andre asks, in a light loop going from 0% to 100% and back, how can I reset the light in the middle of the process based on the percentage it is in? For example, 53 in the middle of the fade out. Andre, I'm not entirely sure I understand your question, so I wonder if you might try restating the question with other words, and I'll take a shot at answering it. Meanwhile, Michael's question, best way of getting two Macs to be used as a main and a backup using Dante without a switcher. Michael, the best way, it requires you to use an audio console that has enough inputs that you can have both your main and your backup Mac feeding the console at the same time. And then if the console has mute groups, you can very simply toggle muting the main Mac and unmuting the backup Mac, or vice versa. That's the simplest way to do it. Another way to do it is, I'm going to use Yamaha terminology, is to use input libraries. So you can actually, if I have 64 channels of audio from my main Mac and 64 channels from my backup Mac, and I have a small Yamaha console that only has 64 channels of input entirely available, I can repatch the whole console to only be patching inputs from the backup Mac instead of the main by using an input library recall. Last time I tried that, I discovered about a 1.5 second lag time. But here is my philosophy about seamless switching from main to backup. My philosophy is, don't worry about seamless switching, because there's only two situations where you switch from your main to your backup. Situation one, you heard an audible problem, in which case seamless switching is already not going to save you. Situation number two, you expect there might be a problem while no queue is running, so you switch preemptively, in which case seamless switching doesn't matter. So that's how I feel about seamless switching. Getting some information from a colleague that some consoles have A and B inputs for each channel and allow you toggle between them. So that's another way. For example, SD consoles and the PM7 have macro access to input patching, so you can flip between the A patch and the B patch. Essentially, these are all variations on the theme of have the console do the switching. Studio Lumumba asks, what is the time zone? I'm in Eastern Daylight Time. Alejandro asks, have you ever used any RS-232 interfaces? What do you recommend? What app do you use to connect? I have not used RS-232 in a very long time, I'm glad to say. I feel that RS-232 will do us a great favor when it disappears from this earth, but that is just my opinion. If you use RS-232 routinely, the device I recommend is a box made by Moxa. I'm going to try to find Moxa's website. Yeah, here we go. Ethernet. Serial device servers. So this may not be the exact right page, but Moxa makes these boxes. They take an Ethernet connection and you send them plain text over UDP, and then they take that plain text and turn it into RS-232. I've not done it. People I know have done it, and they say it works like gangbusters. So these boxes are not very expensive. I think it's like $100 to $200 for the base model, and that's not no money, but it's not a lot of money. And that's what I recommend if you need to control something that uses RS-232 from QLab. My French pronunciation is terrible, so I will not attempt to pronounce this French theater company's name, who asks, any hope to have QLab 5 adding light effects? Yes, hope. Yes, hope to add that. We are hoping to add light effects soon, and I don't want to make any promises. I will say I'm not much of a lighting designer, but I am a lighting designer some of the time, and so I vividly understand the value of lighting effects, and we at QLab in general, we at Figure 53 in QLab recognize that they're very valuable and we want to have them. And what we don't want to do is do it poorly and quickly. We want to have our lighting effects engine be really, really good. And so we're going to wait a little until we've got something really great, and then we're going to release that. A-Room, your documentation is fantastic. Thank you, A-Room, for complimenting the documentation. I appreciate it. Josh Samuels asks, is it best practice to keep all show files off of the desktop? Yeah, actually, it is my recommendation that you do that. Files on the desktop take up system resources because the way that the macOS draws the desktop is essentially as a composited movie of multiple layers. So keeping stuff off the desktop can help. Now, modern Macs are really fast, and so I believe that it is not nearly as much of a problem as it used to be, but if you're talking about squeezing every ounce of power out of your Mac, clearing the desktop is one of the ways you can do that. UXI Film asks, will meters and audio units render it sometime in the future? And Chris answered it in text. That's great. Andy, thank you for jumping in, talking about Moxa. You are the person I know who recommends it, so your commentary, extra valuable. It is now 5:45, so I'm getting ready to sign off. If there is anybody who cannot join us on Thursday, who's got a burning question that they need answered, now is your chance. I also just got a message from a colleague who reminds me that these days you can synchronize the contents of your desktop via iCloud to other computers. And while we don't know exactly, the chances are good that this doesn't help. And so probably the less you have on your desktop, the better, particularly. Many people saying thanks, and the answer to that is you're welcome. I really appreciate you joining me. This has been fun, and I hope it's been fun for you too. Someone is hanging their head in shame over their cluttered desktop. Do not hang your head in shame. All is well. I mean, I guess feel shame if you feel like it, but I don't think it's necessary. And then we have a question about integrated live control for Q outputs with MIDI controllers, faders, motorized, endless encoders. All of that would be awesome. And the day that that happens, I promise you, I will be shouting from the rooftops about how we have that awesome thing. But again, it's on our constantly balancing list about what's the most useful stuff to do right now. Okay. I'm going to wrap it up. Seems like everyone is mostly saying thank you, which really makes me feel good, so I appreciate it. We will be live again on Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, answering any more questions. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for your comments, for your feature requests. Thank you for your questions, and thank you all for being so friendly and helpful and supportive to each other. Stay safe, wash your hands, don't touch your face, look out for viruses, and I'll see some of you hopefully on Thursday.